Rookie pilot using call sign Top Gun crashes fighter on runway during takeoff.
3, 2, 1, flight off.
What's up, everybody? It's Mover, and we're going back through some news articles. This is dated April 22nd, 2020, so it's only about a week and a half old or so. And it cites an accident investigation report of the F-22 at Fallon that basically had a takeoff incident where it ended up landing gear up. So the title is Rookie Pilot Using Call Sign Top Gun Crashes Fighter on Runway During Takeoff. So let's take a look at what the article says, and then we can take a look at the actual accident investigation report, because it's always good to check out the truth data. So the article by the Tribunist, dated April 22nd, 2020, so very recent, says, if you're going to use the phrase Top Gun in your call sign, you should be able to get your $140 million F-22A Raptor off the runway. Top Gun 6.5 had some issues with exactly that. A new report says the rookie pilot pulled the nose up too early. It was a short and dramatic flight and a bit of a rough landing. So this says a new report. And it was a rookie pilot, so I'm assuming maybe he was in the B course or something. He was brand new. I guess they went to Fallon to go do this in the B course. B course being the basic course for the F-22, where you get trained on how to fly it. Here's some fancy pictures. That's actually a TY on the tail, which is a Tyndall jet. The report on April 13, 2018 incident notes that Top Gun 6.5 pulled the nose up too soon and was taking off too slowly. The pilot was supposed to be engaging an F-18 Hornet in basic flight maneuvers. Sorry, I tried to make that right. Basic flight maneuvers near Naval Air Station Fallon in Nevada. BFM as basic fighter maneuvers. The sudden landing didn't give Top Gun 6.5 time to deploy his landing gear. The F-22 took off going 23 knots below the recommended speed, the report found, which was fast enough to leave the ground, but too slow to keep the plane in the air. Well, they got a crane to pick this thing up. Nice. After the crash, all F-22 pilots had to undergo additional training to avoid similar mishaps. One guy shits himself. Top Gun 6.5 was, they'd found, not the only pilot who was pulling up too soon. In what must have been a further indignity, the Air Force noted that the pilot was performing a graduation exercise from the Top Gun program. The plane slid 6,500 feet, 6,514 on its belly after touching down. The pilot safely exited the aircraft after the crash. It is unclear just how badly the plane was damaged in the incident. There were no injuries, fatalities, or damage to civilian property, U.S. Air Force Colonel Jacob Trigler, president of the Accident Investigation Board, wrote in a statement. The MP, mishap pilot, failed to ensure that he was operating the aircraft in accordance with valid toll, takeoff, and landing data, and then prematurely retracted the landing gear, the report read. Some nice Raptors there. If the mishap pilot had performed his takeoff sequence in accordance with the correct toll, or if he delayed his landing gear retraction until the mishap aircraft had accelerated to correct takeoff speed, the mishap would not have occurred. The organization factors contributing to this mishap were significant, influencing and shaping the MP's actions, the report read. In other words, his training had something to do with the steps he took and the results of those steps. These pilots had an inadequate flight brief, organizational acceptance of an incorrect technique, formal training, and organizational overconfidence in equipment. The technique of rotating early will not by itself cause this type of accident. However, rotating early starts a sequence of events that can lead to an early takeoff and early gear retraction. The situation is magnified when an aircraft is operating at high elevation airfield where aircraft performance is decreased. There is a clear trend of rotating early among a significant number of F-22 pilots, including the MP, despite being aware of computed toll. Okay, well, that's the article. Let's see what the report actually says. So this report, dated in November of 2018, came out 7 months after the mishap, so a year and a half ago. So not exactly a recent report, but it is what it is. The date of the incident was 13 April 2018. Here's the lieutenant, who's Colonel, not Lieutenant Colonel, actual Colonel, full bird Colonel Jacob Trigler. So here it is. The mishap pilot flying the mishap aircraft. It was taking off 3-1 left for a Top Gun graduation exercise. Okay. Let's talk about, if you're going to use the Top Gun call sign, you better fly like a Top Gun. Call signs are assigned to bases. Okay, when I flew support missions for Top Gun events. In the Navy, we flew with Top Gun call signs, even Red Air, because you'd go to the airspace under Top Gun 6-9 or whatever, and then once you're in the airspace, you change your call sign to whatever your tactical call sign is, because the Navy uses 2 different call signs. He wasn't just, oh, I'm Top Gun, just going to willy-nilly use a call sign. It was the assigned, fragged call sign that he had to use because that's what the base assigned for his flight plan. I mean, every aircraft participating in this, they're all assigned a Top Gun, so each squadron, each event has its own assigned ATC call sign. That means nothing. It wasn't like he was showboating like, oh, I'm Top Gun today. That's not how it works. He was to go out and fly to a point, meet a Top Gun F-18 Hornet basic fighter maneuvers. So a BFM mission, and that's their GradX. They go and they fight dissimilar, and the Raptors were in town doing a det, doing that support. It's good training for both parties. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. So his duty day began with a mass brief at 8 o'clock in the morning by a local Navy pilot. So obviously it's a Top Gun mission. Top Gun briefed it. They plan to fly VFR departure in accordance with the brief and their specific lineup card. So, I mean, it's a nice day. They take off. There's local procedures. Fallon, I'm very familiar with Fallon. I've done that a bunch of times. It's usually just a VFR takeoff. They get you to the airspace because you're in the airspace almost immediately after takeoff. That's what's so nice about the location of Fallon. So anyway, they talked about all the collision avoidance, how they were going to get to the airspace, what they were going to do. None of the 90th Fighter Squadron pilots interviewed noted anything abnormal about the brief. So 4 of them were going out, and then they discussed hydration, hygiene maneuvering, airspace, all the standard stuff you would talk about in a brief. Takeoff and landing data was not computed in accordance with applicable tech order data for the conditions at NAS Fallon on the day of the mishap, and the toll displayed on the mishap pilot's lineup card was incorrect. So the way toll data works, takeoff and landing data, we put it on our lineup card, and you'll have like rotation speed, refusal speed, all the standard numbers that you need, and that's either computed by hand, so you can use a checklist to do it. You can use, sometimes they've created Excel spreadsheets that'll gonk the numbers for you, and then there's also mission planning software that'll do it. So typically cross-country, you know, you obviously don't have the mission planning capabilities you would at home base, so sometimes they'll do like an Excel spreadsheet, or they'll create a standard card with some baseline assumptions that have the correct toll data, you know, various versions of the same card. So you've got like, hey, here's an 80 degree, here's a 90 degree, etc., you know, just for simplicity's sake. But it's still correct toll data. But they didn't compute in accordance with the tech order for the conditions at Fallon. They'll talk about this. So what he had, when he was walking out the door, the numbers he had to take off were just wrong. So following the brief, they had 45 minutes of step time between the brief and step. So step is when you put all your gear on, go to the aircraft. Mishap pilot and one of the other pilots got some food and water before returning to the hangar. They discussed the upcoming mission. There was nothing abnormal at that point. They put their gear on, stepped. At 10:36, so he started engine normally. Everything up to taxi was normal. He took the runway without incident, pushed the power up to mil power. Everything was normal. Accelerated down the runway until 120 knots, at which point he rotated to a 10-degree pitch attitude because obviously, you know, on this aircraft, as you rotate, you hold the nose up, and then it gets a flying airspeed and goes. As the mishap pilot accelerated to 142 knots, he recognized his visual cues for takeoff and retracted the landing gear. So he talks about visual cues for takeoff. You know, we talk about climbing rate or positive rate gear up, you know, in civilian aircraft, or 2 climbing, 2 indications that you're climbing. But he had something else, which we'll talk about here in a second. At approximately, he raised the gear 1 second after the weight on wheel switch indicated off. As the landing gear retracted, the aircraft reached a maximum speed of 148 knots. So basically, he rotates, he's like 10 degrees nose high, so he's like, okay, I'm airborne, pulls back, gets that little bit of weight off wheel switch, thinks he's climbing away from the ground, and picks the gear up. So it kind of does a hop. As the gear comes up, you got drag from the gear doors and the gear moving. The aircraft basically settles back on the ground. The mishap's belly completely made contact with the surface. At this point, as he contacts, he goes full afterburner. He does that for 1 second, then goes right back to idle. So I guess he was like, oh, I can get out of this. And like, no, I really can't. I'm skidding down the runway. The MP lowered the tail hook in accordance with abort procedure. So now he's going through the abort bull face. and obviously that didn't do a whole lot for you. It continued to intermittently impact the runway surface until the aircraft came to a complete stop, so it just bounced off the runway because there's nothing for it to grab. Basically, it came to a stop, he shut down, emergency crews responded, he got out, and everything seemed normal. So they looked through the forms, they didn't find anything abnormal. They looked through the inspections, so basically they looked through all of the inspection history of this aircraft to see what was wrong with it, possibly. Fuel, oil, hydraulic was all normal. They had gone from Tyndall to Fallon, so they'd gone through Shepherd and Colorado Springs, no issues of fuel. They even checked the oxygen because the F-22s had issues with oxygen in the past, and everything seemed normal. There was some unscheduled maintenance for electronic warfare software and some LO coding evaluations, and also a seat not-armed indication, but nothing that they believed affected this flight. They also looked at the DTC. At one point it didn't record, but for this sortie it did, and everything functioned normally. They looked at the landing gear system. Everything seemed to be normal. The engines were good. There was visual disparity between the left and right engine nozzles after the mishap. During a typical engine shutdown with positive weight on wheel indications, nozzles are commanded to full open and locked. During the flight, the nozzles are commanded by one of the aircraft system based on current flight conditions. With in-flight engine shutdowns, the nozzles will float as opposed to being locked. During the mishap aircraft transitioned to an in-flight state when the gear was retracted. So they said that's normal for what you see, even though you look at the pictures and it doesn't look like it would for a normal shutdown. So it basically responded in accordance with the in-flight shutdown. That's why the nozzles floated. Recovery team, additional support. The team identified a right alpha probe transducers with multiple small nicks within the first 2 inches. It's unclear whether the damage occurred before, during, or after the mishap. So that could be the AOA probe, maybe, but they're not really sure. It's used by the F-22 to calculate speed, angle of attack, and angle of side slip. The right alpha probe was removed for non-destructive evaluation with no significant findings. So maybe additional analysis is performed of the following components to rule out causality in relation to the mishap: the side stick, the brag valve, and the pilot breathing hose. And they basically said nothing significant concern in relation to the root cause of the mishap. The weather was beautiful, 8,000 feet. Altimeter was 3045, 8 degrees Celsius. So it's a nice day out to go flying. Crew qualifications. Let's see what this rookie pilot was all about. Was he a B course guy? Was he brand new? Oh, he was a 4-ship flight lead, 340 hours in the F-22, 234 hours in the sim. He flew the T-38 as an adversary pilot, just like me. At Tyndall, and accumulated 192 hours in T-38. He had a total time of 575 hours in F-22, T-38, T-38C aircraft. He accomplished an annual instrument check ride on 7 March, demonstrated the required proficiency. Also include emergency procedures sim. He successfully did that. He completed his mission check ride. Everything was good. He'd even gone through the 4-flug. He had 15 sorties in 30 days, 24 sorties. He wasn't a rookie. He was an experienced pilot, and actually had flown a lot in the F-22. So I don't know where they got rookie. I mean, I know it's just semantics, but I mean, it's poor reporting. It really is. This guy wasn't a rookie. He might not have been, you know, an 05 or a major or a lieutenant colonel type. He wasn't experienced, super experienced, but he wasn't a rookie. Crew rest, all they found that he had been busy. So basically, the ones assigned to participate in the Top Gun Grad X experienced a high ops tempo prior to the mishap. They flew from Elmo to Tyndall with other members of their squadron. At Tyndall, they participated in a WESIP, Weapon System Evaluation Program, for 10 days, flying frequently. So they were on their way back from doing ops at Tyndall and just, hey, we're going to support this Grad X at Top Gun. So there was a lot of flying and some fatigue. And you can tell that by his crew time. I mean, in 30 days, 15 sorties in a month is a lot. I mean, it's a lot. 8 to 10 is about, you know, a normal month. 10 being on the high side. 15 sorties he's flying a lot, especially in an F-22. F-22s don't fly as much as other airframes. All right, let's talk human factors. They said, here's what happened. Incorrect application of the told. A normal F-22 takeoff sequence begins with the pilot advancing the throttles, accelerating to the computed rotation speed. The pilot then applies slight aft pressure to raise the nose to 10 to 12 degrees pitch attitude. While holding this, the aircraft will become airborne at the computed takeoff speed. The computed rotation takeoff speeds vary based on the weight of the aircraft and pressure altitude and calculated prior to takeoff. Remember that, pressure altitude. Fallon is not at sea level. For the mishap aircraft on the day of the mishap, the rotation speed and takeoff speed should have been 143 and 164 knots respectively. However, he did it at 120 and weight off wheels at 135. So he's 23 knots slow when he's rotating. So on a normal takeoff, ends when the pilot ensures he's got a positive rate of climb, establishes and retracts the landing gear. Common indicators, positive rate of climb includes the visual cues, the climb dive marker, so flight path marker, velocity vector, whichever you call it, above the horizon, increasing vertical velocity indicator, so feet per minute, it's something greater than 0. Takeoff should occur at calculated takeoff speed and should be retracted after the airplane is safely airborne. Therefore, landing gear retraction should not occur prior to takeoff speed. During the mishap sortie, after rotation achieving weight off wheels, the mishap pilot described using peripheral vision and the surroundings to getting smaller to determine he was airborne. So basically he sees stuff moving away from him. So he was using only visual cues, and he's like, hey, I'm airborne, let's get the gear up. Plus, got to look a little cool because we're taking off in front of the Navy guys. He did not use the flight path marker or VVI to verify positive rate of climb, so he only used what he could see outside. He sensed that the aircraft was airborne. He probably heard the click or felt the click of the weight off wheel switch. I don't know if the Raptor does that, but in some aircraft that you can actually feel or hear it click. But he didn't realize he was 22 knots slow. The lift generated was insufficient to maintain flight. He settled back onto the runway on its belly. So they talk about the damage to the alpha probe. One qualified crew chief is required to inspect the left and right alpha probes for damage or instruction. Damage is defined as noticeable to touch by rubbing hand or thumbnail over suspected damage area. If either probe is damaged, the jet is considered non-mission capable and it's grounded, pending further maintenance action. On the day of the mishap, the aircraft was inspected, but no damage was noted. The AIB MRT identified a right alpha probe transducer with multiple small nicks within the first 2 inches. They don't know how it occurred. So they're saying, hey, it could be part of the problem here. Distraction. Distraction was a factor. Interruption of attention or inappropriate redirection of attention by environmental cue or mental process. Well, he's been flying a lot. He's at a strange field. He's been cross-country. He's not at his home field. He's getting tired. So they talk about how he's flown over a 5-month period. His landing gear, they actually look back at his landing gear retraction timing, was pretty much within what his peers were doing. It's 5.6 seconds after rotation, 2.1 seconds after weight off wheels. For each sortie flown, there's a graph on this. It was always at sea level airfield. So basically, as soon as he got weight off wheels, takeoff speed, he's going. But during the mishap sortie, the mishap pilot retracted the landing gear twice as fast as his usual timing after weight off wheels. So at sea level, he was doing 1 speed, and then here at higher elevation, he was actually twice as fast. So he put the gear up real fast. Possibly, again, trying to get that, what they call the low transition. But it doesn't say here, and we're not going to accuse. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it if you do it right. He noted some fatigue, but not excess fatigue that would affect safety of flight. Mishap pilot also stated there were no aircraft system issues on the day. No abnormal radio calls were made during taxi that would distract him. He did not remember any specific distractions. Worth noting that the timing of his landing gear retraction was faster than the previous sortie. So they went back. They can get the data on everything. Mission planning. This is where they go, hey, this is probably the biggest thing. Most mission planning for the Fallon TDY was completed earlier in the week while at Tyndall for the WESP. During the mission planning, one of the pilots that was involved created lineup cards for each of the 3 cross-country sorties and the sorties at Fallon. The told on all 4 cards was based on 80-degree told, so it's warmer, so that's a little bit more conservative. However, it was computed using a 90 FS Excel spreadsheet tool that assumes Elmendorf conditions. Well, that is sea level elevation and a 10,000-foot runway versus, and it was computed to be done at home bases where you're at sea level, you just get the numbers real quick and you go. However, at Fallon, it's almost 4,000 feet of elevation, and the runway length is 13,961 feet. So the numbers don't match. 80 degrees, whereas the temperature was 46 degrees. So it was colder, which was helping, but the density altitude, or the altitude in general, was not so good. Inadequate flight briefs. The flight lead should give a logical briefing to promote safety. It also says you got to review takeoff data, and it sounds like they did not do that for the specific airfield. On the day of the mishap, mass brief was conducted, but there was not a formal brief, so they didn't go from big brief, the mass brief with all the Top Gun dudes. They kind of just bro level, hey, we're good, see you, high five, we'll see you at step, let's go get breakfast. So they didn't necessarily get to the, there was not a formal brief among the 4 90th FS pilots, although they did have informal discussions while at breakfast about their respective missions there. Failed to identify unsafe practices, the improper rotation technique. And this is what that article was trying to talk about how everybody was doing it wrong and everybody got retraining. So there's a technique I heard from somewhere, don't know where. This is what he stated. I was at the B course of the 90th. To initiate rotation, if you have 136, kind of standard below 2,000 feet. That you initiate aft stick pressure at 120, so nose is up at rotation speed, has been my habit pattern. Remember, F-22 is single seat. There's never an IP in the cockpit with you. So if you get a bad habit, it sticks with you unless somebody sees it in a sim or something like that. There's no way to break that chain. So if you heard a technique and you started doing it day one, there's no way to break that because it's just you and the jet. And unless somebody notices it from the other aircraft or something, it is very hard to break that chain. So, and it sounds like this was just what's called WOM, word of mouth, that a lot of people were doing. So they went back over a 5-month period and shows that the Mishap pilot did that, 120 plus or minus 5 knots. Technique of rotating early does not appear to be limited to this guy. They looked at all the 90th FS pilots, and it shows that at 64.3% of the sorties, it was initiated greater than 5 knots prior to the calculated rotation speed, which is in 52.1% of the rotation occurs at 120 plus or minus 5. So it became a trend item. Everybody was doing it. So basically, after the mishap at a pilot meeting, half said that they consistently use the early rotation technique. There's a trend of rotating early among a significant number of pilots. So they basically said, hey, this is kind of a trend. Everybody's doing it. Let's correct it. What happens, though, is when you rotate early, it has two major negative effects on told. Remember, the told was already wrong in the first place. First, you're increasing your induced drag at very early in your takeoff. And second, which slows down the jet's acceleration, extending your takeoff roll, which invalidates basically all the numbers on there. The abort speeds are calculated by applicable TO. More importantly, early rotation usually leads to getting airborne prematurely in ground effect, which is the effect of additional buoyancy produced by cushion of air below the vehicle moving close to the ground. It discovered that 80.4% of all pilots sampled became airborne greater than 5 knots before achieving their takeoff speed. At sea level, it's not a bad problem. At 4,000 feet, it is a problem. It builds a bad habit pattern when flying at high elevation airfields, which deployed airfields can typically be, so it's not a good thing to bring with you. I mean, if your home station's fine, but you need to have a habit that works everywhere. Becoming airborne in ground effect can have similar visual signals to becoming airborne at the correct takeoff speed, resulting in the pilot initiating landing gear retraction. Remember we talked about he was only using what he saw, not what the instruments were telling him. 26.8% of sample pilots retracted their gear prior to achieving takeoff speed, and 10.7% of those retracted over 10 knots slower than their takeoff speed. Again, sea level, it's not a problem. Higher altitude is. Because every F-22 base, except Nellis, is at sea levels, F-22 pilots do not have much experience taking off at high elevation airfield. It should be noted, though, that on their way to Fallon, they went to Colorado Springs, Shepherd, and there are no observed changes in any of the sample pilots' rotation speeds or takeoff speeds. Every pilot continued to fly the aircraft as if he were taking off at his home airfield, with many still using incorrect technique of rotating at 120 knots regardless of told. So this is an institutionalized problem. This data suggests pilots are not referencing their airspeed prior to retracting gear, but instead relying on the visual sensation of the aircraft leaving the ground, having an internal clock which tells them retract the gear based on experience. Internal clock's important. It'll keep you safe, but it also gets you in trouble. If you rely on that habit too much and not trust your instruments, you know, you're just used to the pacing of things, how things work. Okay, I should be, you know, I've talked about this story before, but I flew several combat sorties for several months in Iraq, and I came back to do BFM, and I was used to flying a heavily loaded external fuel tank with bombs and a targeting pod, and I got into a clean jet, and I ended up supersonic at the merge, pulling 9.8 Gs because I was used to the internal clock of here's how long it takes to accelerate with all that drag on the jet, and I was in a clean jet and hit the merge way too fast. So it happens. I mean, it's definitely a common thing. This puts many pilots at an unnecessary risk. Here are the pilot trends. They nerded out and put it into some charts. 80.4%, so most of them were doing this. B course sorties, CMR. So the B course is the basic course. That's the students. And then the combat mission ready pilots were basically the mishap pilot, and then high elevation airfield. So they were even doing it at high elevation airports. Formal training is a factor when one-time or initial training programs, upgrade programs, or other training that is conducted outside local unit results in undesirable outcomes. So they went and blamed the B course for this. B course teaches pilots the fundamental of flying the F-22. Data from multiple sorties from 2 recent B course classes was analyzed. So they went all the way back to some recent classes graduating and learning how to fly the F-22, and it showed that 64%, so the majority of the students rotated greater than 5 knots below computer rotation speed. So this really was how he had been trained. This was a no-kidding thing. 44% at 120 plus or minus 5. 100% of the students retracted their gear after achieving takeoff speed. So they're just up gear, up gear. And it does make sense, especially cold days. I don't know what the gear speed is for the F-22. I don't know if they talk about this, but like in the F-16, even with a 300 knot gear speed, or even the T-38, or any fighter really, a lot of times on a cold day at sea level, you're worried about getting the gear up fast enough so you don't overspeed the gear, especially in afterburner. So that could play into it too, is you get this habit pattern of, hey, as soon as I'm climbing away, I got to get the gear up so I don't overspeed the doors, I don't overspeed the landing gear, because obviously is a bad thing to do. Organizational overconfidence in equipment is a factor. So basically they're like, F-22 engines produce more thrust than any other current fighter engine, and they take it for granted because they got a lot of power. And can't think of a time where I've been concerned with told based on the thrust available. Yep, so they're like, who cares? I got loads of dinosaurs I can throw at the back of any given time. I'm not worried about it. Multiple pilots, included the Mishap pilot, noted that the told is emphasized more in the T-38 community than the F-22. That is true, because we are an aircraft that does not fly very well on one engine, and on a hot day with one engine can be very disastrous. So we really need hold. We don't have good brakes, and we don't have a hook. So, we don't have a whole lot of options versus a Raptor that does. There is a clear perception among F-22 pilots the aircraft has sufficient thrust and braking capability to overcome deviations from told. This perception has led to a decreased emphasis on told. So basically, institutionally, they're like, yeah, make sure the numbers are on there. That's about right, but we're not going to worry about it as much versus T-38, where he had come from, where it's like, no, we need to have these numbers because, we need them. What happens if I lose an engine at high altitude? It's gonna really suck. Opinion summary. I find that the causes were 2 procedural errors by the Mishap pilot: incorrect told, and more importantly, failed to apply any corrections to told during this takeoff sequence. Second, he prematurely retracted the gear, and he wasn't airborne and flying. I find that 4 additional factors subsequently contributed, and that's the flight brief over breakfast, organizational acceptance of an incorrect technique, formal training, so they blame the B course, and organizational overconfidence in the equipment. Although the mishap occurred during specific procedural errors, the organization factors contributed to this mishap were significant influencing. So that's why they had to do more training, because he'd been trained wrong. He'd been trained, hey, 120 knots, get the gear up, go. You don't have to worry about it. It's an F-22. You got lots and lots of power. But hey, when you rotate early, it by itself may not be bad, but if it can start an error chain, and we always talk about, you got to break the error chain. It can just snowball into something much worse. And there you go. Significance is magnified when it's at a higher elevation. So Fallon bites him. A lot of people thought that this was, a showboating thing. I don't think that that's the case. However, picking the gear up a little bit earlier than you used to, it could be, hey, I'm gonna, make this takeoff look good. So he wants to get the gear up, wants it to look nice and slick as he's, going down the runway, squat the jet and go. But, that obviously wasn't causal here. And if he'd had the correct hold, and if he had retracted the gear normally, none of this would have happened. So, people ask what happens in these cases. Typically, when a mishap like this happens, if it's a mistake, then, after some retraining, you go back to flying. It's not a one mistake Air Force or Navy or whatever. This gentleman, whoever the mishap pilot was, which is why this is anonymous, is probably back flying the F-22 now, and he had a good career. He was a 4-ship flight lead, so he's actually already on a good path. So I would not think that this would be a career ender. Probably a little embarrassing, but stuff happens. We make mistakes and we learn from them, and there's a lot of mitigating factors in this. Hope you liked this segment. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed my interview with Lieutenant Colonel Dan Rooney of Folds of Honor. Please check that out if you haven't already. Support Folds of Honor if you're looking for a good cause. They are very worthy, and I do highly support them. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Excuse me. Oh, no. Oh! About a lot of that. Usually fly with the doors off. All pots too. There'll be a douche. That's rule number one. Make them tell you no.